Pals, this is Dear Disney. We're going to start again with our presentation of Walt Disney, an American original. Today we're going to cover Section 1, Chapters 1 through 3. Last time we went over all the prefaces, the prologues, the letters of recommendation, explaining what Bob Thomas, the writer, ability to make sure that this is the most up-to-date, most exacting biography of Walt Disney. So we begin with Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas, Section 1, The Midwest Years, Chapter 1. Inceny-sur-Mer is a small windswept village on the Normandy coast, a few kilometers from the beaches where Allied troops landed on June 6, 1944. 9 centuries before, French soldiers sailed from the same coast to invade England, and among them were Hughes Disney and his son Robert. The family remained in England, their name becoming anglicized to Disney. During the Restoration, a branch of the Disney clan moved to Ireland, settling in County Kilkenny. Arundel Elias Disney was born there in 1801, and in 1834 he and his brother Robert sailed from Liverpool with their families to begin new lives in America. After a month's voyage, they arrived in New York on October 3rd. The two brothers parted, Robert heading for a farm in the Midwest, Elias traveling to the Canadian frontier in Godric Township, Ontario. The first white men had settled there only 9 years before. Other immigrants, Scottish, Pennsylvanian, German, Irish, were attracted to the land by promises of roads and improvements and prices of 7 shillings and sixpence per acre. But the land company failed to keep its promises, and the settlers found they had brought their families to wilderness without roads, mills, schools, or churches. Elias Disney saw hope in the vast acreage, with its rushing trout-filled streams, forests alive with deer and elk, meadows abounding with wild plums and berries. He built a mill beside the Maitland River and prospered by grinding wheat and sawing timber for his neighbors. His wife, Maria, gave him 16 children, the eldest being Keppel Disney, born in Ireland in 1832. The Disney mill thrived for many years, then bad times descended on Godric. Elias was forced to default on his mortgages. Son Keppel married an Irish-born immigrant, Mary Richardson, and they settled in the nearby Blue Vale district. Keppel was a strapping, black-bearded man who tried a variety of enterprises, from drilling for oil to operating a salt well. He disliked the Canadian winters, and in 1878 he took off for the California goldfields with his oldest son, Elias, and Robert. Passing through Kansas, Keppel Disney was convinced by a railroad agent to buy 200 acres of Union Pacific land near Ellis. He sent for the rest of his family to join him on their new farm. Because he couldn't afford lumber, he built them a house made of sod. The farmhouse began to thrive on cattle and wheat, but Keppel still resisted the high prices the railroad charged for lumber. He quarried rock and built a house of stone. Elias Disney, an eldest son of Keppel's 11 children, became restless on the farm and left for a job as a machinist in a railroad shop, where a co-worker was Walter Chrysler, founder of the automotive empire. Elias moved on to join the work crew pushing the Union Pacific line through Colorado. When the railroad reached Denver, his job as apprentice carpenter was over. Jobs were scarce in Denver, and Elias tried to earn a living by playing his fiddle with 2 other amateur musicians outside saloons. The returns were skimpy, and Elias returned to the family farm in Ellis. Part of the reason for Elias's return to Kansas was Flora Call, the pretty daughter of the Disney's neighbor, the Charles Calls. The Call family was Scottish and English. The first to immigrate, Thomas Call, arrived in Boston in 1636. A descendant, Eber Call, moved to Ohio in 1825, and his son Charles left Oberlin College to join the 1849 gold rush to California. He found no gold and returned to Ohio, later settling his wife, 8 daughters, and 2 sons in Ellis, Kansas, where he taught school. The prairie blizzards convinced Charles Call to move his family to Florida in 1884. Keppel Disney also grew weary of the Kansas winters, and he and his son Elias accompanied their neighbors to Florida. Keppel decided against making the move permanent and returned to his Kansas farm. Elias remained in Florida. He bought a 40-acre farm at Kismet and continued his courtship of Flora Call, who had become a grammar school teacher. They were married on New Year's Day, 1888, in her parents' home in Akron, Florida. Elias was 28. His bride was 19. Photographs of Elias and Flora Disney provide hints of their natures. He with starched collar and heavy woolen, ready-made suit, big-eared with hawk nose, alert eyes, and a stern face. She in a high-necked dress, deep-set eyes, heavy-lidded, wide mouth pursed, but with a hint of humor. They were a devoted couple, and she remained patient and understanding through his many adventures in business. First, Elias sold his farm and bought a hotel in Daytona Beach, but the tourist trade slumped and he was forced out of business. Now he had a son, Herbert, born December 8th, 1888, and Elias went to work as a rural mailman and managed to buy a small orange grove. Then war scars swept the country. Overwhelmed with patriotism, he enlisted in the militia. The crisis soon dissolved, and Elias saw no sense in remaining in the militia, not when he had a wife and baby son and an orange grove to care for. So he walked out of the army camp and went home. Military police arrived at his house to arrest him as a deserter. "I didn't desert. There isn't any war," he reasoned. The army men could find no answer to his logic. "At least you must give back the uniform," one insisted. "No, sir. I didn't get paid, so I'm going to keep the uniform," Elias replied. And Elias was stricken with malaria. He decided, as he often did when his luck turned sour, that his life would improve if he moved on. He chose Chicago. 70 years before, Chicago had been a collection of huts on the shore of Lake Michigan. By 1889, when Elias and Flora Disney arrived with their infant son, it was a brawny city of 1.2 million citizens, the railroad hub sending wheat and beef to the east and cloth and threshers to the west. After a lifetime in small towns, Elias Disney was bewildered by the city's clamor, but he was determined to succeed after his failure in Florida. First, he needed shelter for his young family. He decided to build his own house, applying the carpentry he had learned on the Union Pacific. Flora said she would design it for him. "There's nothing mysterious about drawing up plans for a house," she argued, "and a woman ought to know more about making it livable." Following her plans, he built a square, trim, neat little house at 1249 Trip Avenue, one of the two paved roads in the northwest part of Chicago. Elias painted the house white with blue trim, and visitors admired its clean lines and economy. He bought the adjoining lot and constructed another house, which he offered for sale. He began building homes in other parts of Chicago, and he developed relationships with bankers who provided loans for prospective buyers. Flora drew up the plans, bought the building materials, did the bookkeeping, and even furnished the new house the buyer so desired. In 1893, when building was in a slump, Elias took a job as a carpenter for the World's Columbian Exposition, working 7 days a week at $1 a day. The family was growing. Raymond Arnold Disney was born on December 3rd, 1890, and Roy Oliver Disney on June 24th, 1893. Elias and his wife and sons worshipped at St. Paul Congregational Church and became a close friend of the preacher, Walter Parr. Elias volunteered to build a new church for the congregation. He put up a plain, serviceable structure with a tall, sloped roof. Flora played the organ in the new church, and Elias preached the sermon when the preacher was on vacation. When both their wives became pregnant in 1901, Elias made a proposal to the preacher. "If I get a baby boy, I'll name him after you. If your baby is a boy, you name him after me." Walter Parr agreed. A fourth son was born to Elias and Flora Disney in the upper bedroom of the Trip Avenue house on Sunday, December 5th, 1901. Keeping his bargain with the preacher, Elias named the boy Walter Elias Disney. The Parr baby was also a boy, and he was named Elias. It had been 8.5 years since her last son had been born, and Flora Disney lavished attention on young Walter. He was a sweet-natured baby, handsomer than the other boys, who had their father's strong Roman nose. The mother liked to dress Walter in frilly clothes. Roy uncomplainingly pushed his little brother in a baby carriage up and down Fifth Avenue, and even bought Walter toys out of his own earnings, a gesture which might be considered prophetic. 2 years and a day after Walter's arrival, the first daughter was born to the Disneys, and she was named Ruth Flora. By this time, Elias had grown concerned about rearing his children in the big city. The neighborhood was filling it up with Poles and Irish and Swedes, most of them hard-working, God-fearing people. But the old world family ties were unraveling, and some of the children ran wild while their parents scraped for a living. Not far away from the Disney neighborhood was Cicero, later the headquarters of Al Capone and other notorious criminals. Elias Disney's concern grew each time he passed the street corner with its three saloons. His mind was made up when two neighborhood boys were arrested for killing a policeman in a car barn robbery. One was sentenced to Joliet prison for 20 years, and the other to life imprisonment. Flora, those two boys are no older than Herb and Ray, Elias said to his wife. We've got to get out of this cesspool of a city. Flora agreed with her husband's proposal to move the family to the rural atmosphere they had known in their early lives. Elia visited communities in Colorado and Alabama where he had heard of opportunities, but none seemed suitable. Then he went to Marceline, Missouri, where his brother Robert owned property. The country was fertile with green, rolling hills, a pleasant little town where supplies could be bought, and enough industry there were coal mines and oil wells for economic stability. Marceline, Elias Disney decided, would be the place where he could earn a good living and rear his 5 children in a wholesome Christian atmosphere. Chapter 2. Walt Disney remembered nothing of his early years in Chicago, but the memories of Marceline stayed with him throughout his lifetime. He recalled the place where he lived. It was a beautiful farm with a wide front lawn, big weeping willow trees. It had 2 orchards, one called the Old, one called the New. One variety was called Wolf River apples, and they were so big that people came from miles around to see them. Marceline was one of the multitude of towns that owed their existence to the railroad. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was spreading through Missouri in 1888, and a new village grew up beside its tracks in Lynn County near the center of the state, 120 miles from Kansas City. The first settlers decided to call the place after the name of the railroad superintendent's daughter, Marceline. By April of 1906, when the Disney family arrived to take over the Crane farm, Marceline had become a community of 5,000 people. They were hard workers. Some were employed in the nearby coal mine, number 1, some in the oil and natural gas fields. Merchants sold their wares in the red brick and sandstone stores along Main Street. Most of the population lived on farms, growing fruit, vegetables, wheat, and barley, and raising beef and pork for the big city markets. Flora Disney arrived first, bringing her 3 youngest children, Roy, Walt, and Ruth. Elias Disney and the 2 older sons, Herb and Ray, came a few days later in a boxcar loaded with the family belongings, including a pair of horses Elias had bought in the Chicago stockyards. The family settled into the neat, square, 1-storied, whitewashed house built by Civil War veteran William Crane, recently deceased. Elias had purchased a house and 45 acres at a price of $125 an acre, promising installment payments with money he was to receive for Chicago houses he had built. Elias and the 3 older sons went to work immediately, plowing the spring fields and planting large areas of corn and sorghum, lesser amounts of wheat and barley. Elias bought cows for milking and pigs, chicken, and pigeons to feed the family. Flora Disney worked constantly, preparing huge meals, washing and mending the men's shirts and coveralls, hoeing the vegetable garden, churning butter to trade for provisions at the grocery store. Her butter was so sweet and pure that the groceryman gave it special position on his counter. Walt, a wiry, tow-headed boy with searching eyes, tagged after his mother to help with her chores. He was followed by little Ruth. The farm and its surroundings were an endless source of wonderment to the boy. He played in the mud under a bridge near the houses, waving shyly to farmer neighbors as they passed by in their buggies. He herded the pigs in new grubbing places, and they permitted him to ride on their backs, a feat that Elias Disney showed off to visitors. Walt gave special attention to a runty piglet he named Skinny. He nursed Skinny with a baby bottle, and the pig followed him around the farm like a pet dog. As one season blended into the next, Walt learned to anticipate and enjoy the cycles of farm life. During the sorghum harvest, his father and brothers cut the cane and fed into the horse-powered squeezer. Walt led the horse around in a circle until the cane was mashed. The molasses was stored in big vats and poured on breakfast pancakes or baked in cakes and gingerbread. If the crop had been bountiful, the excess was siphoned into brown earthen jugs and bartered at the grocery store in Marceline. Harvesting time brought the big, puffy steam thresher to the farm. The neighbors' wagons hitched behind it. While the men worked in the fields, the women filled the kitchen with gossip and the aromas of fried chicken, cornbread, and chocolate cake. At noontime, the men came to the house and ate huge meals, exchanging views about the size and worth of the harvest. Then they stretched out on the lawn under the willow tree and slept for an hour before returning to the fields. Hog killing time brought neighbors back to the farm, and they helped Elias slaughter the animals and dip the carcasses into huge boiling kettles. The bristles were scraped off, and well honed knives sliced the remains for ham, bacon, sausage, and head cheese. As Walter grew older, he wandered farther from the Disney farm, sometimes with his brother Roy. Nearby were woods overgrown with walnut, hickory nut, hazelnut, persimmon, wild grape, and chokeberry, all in their seasons offering food for passerbys. Walt learned to watch for animals that lived in the woods: rabbits, foxes, squirrels, possums, and raccoons. He scanned the trees for birds: bobwhite, crow, hawk, woodpecker, meadowlark, cardinal, wren, swallow, wild dove. On hot summer days, Walt and Roy walked the few miles to the Yellow Creek and cooled themselves in the slow-moving waters. The Santa Fe Railroad tracks ran through the countryside a short distance from the Disney farm, and Walt would put his ears to the rail to hear the train coming. He always hoped that the engineer would be his Uncle Mike Martin, who worked the route between Fort Madison and Marceline, and often stayed with the Disneys overnight, bringing a striped bag of candy for the children. Another diversion for Walt was watching the horseless carriages chug by on the county pike road in front of the farm. They had just begun to appear in the Marceline. Things happened to young Walt that he could remember with absolute clarity in his mature years. He wandered through an orchard on a summer Sunday and saw an owl on the branch on an apple tree. He reached up to pet the owl, but it flew away. Walt pursued, found the owl perched within reach, and put his hands over it. The owl screeched and clawed. Instinctively, Walt threw the owl to the ground and stomped on it. The boy was overcome by remorse to find the owl dead, and he buried it in a small grave. For months afterwards, the owl returned in Walt's dreams. The most persistent family legend about Walt's boyhood on the farm was always described as his first attempt at art. The incident was recalled by his sister, Ruth, in an interview almost 70 years afterwards. My folks had gone to town, and Walt and I were left there alone. We spied a big barrel of tar and opened it up. As we were looking at it, Walt said, "Oh, this would be real good to paint with." He added, "Let's paint on the house." I wondered if it would come off, and he said, "Oh, sure." So we went to work on the long sides of the White House, the side that faced the main road. He drew houses, I remember, with smoke coming out of them, and I drew zigzags. 2 rows of them. We dipped big sticks into the tar, and I can remember the awful feeling we realized a little bit later: the tar wouldn't budge. My father was so angry that he just left it there. It was still there on the side of the house when we moved. His mother taught Walt how to read. Elias Disney decreed that it was more convenient for the boy to wait until Ruth was old enough for school, and Walt was almost 7 before he was enrolled at the Park School, a 2-story red brick building with 200 students in grade and high school. Walt read the standard texts, the McCuffey Eclectic Reader, and studied arithmetic, writing, geography, and spelling. His grades were only fair because he was always finding things that interested him more than schoolwork. One of his new discoveries was a movie house that had just opened in Marceline. One day after school, he persuaded Ruth to accompany him to the theater, and on the bedsheet screen they saw an enactment of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. It was dark when they emerged, and they hurried home, fearful of what would happen to them for staying out so late. Nothing did, because their parents were so relieved that the 2 children were safe. The years in Marceline provided Walt Disney with a gallery of memorable characters. Warm-hearted Aunt Margaret, who came from Kansas City with crayons and pads to encourage Walt's drawings. Grandma Disney, full of mischief in her 70s, urging her grandson to fetch her turnips from a neighbor's farm. Uncle Robert Disney, an elegant figure who kept a cigar in his mouth even when his Van Dyke beard was being trimmed in the barber shop. Uncle Ed, considered dim-witted by outsiders, but by his family simply a boy who never grew up. Walt found him a perfect companion, a grown-up who liked to do boyish things. They wandered the countryside together, and when Uncle Ed wanted to go to town, he simply flagged down the train and climbed aboard. Walt visited the nearby farm at Russ Taylor and listened to the Civil War veteran recount the Battle of Shiloh and Bull Run. The boy rode into town with Doc Sherwood and Black Prince Albert, frock-coat and beardless, having pulled out his whiskers one by one. The eccentric retired physician commissioned a portrait of himself in his prize stallion Rupert and paid Walt a shiny new quarter for his drawing. At first, Elias Disney was viewed with suspicion by his farming neighbors. He came, after all, from the big city, full of socialistic ideas. Some of the farmers, angered by having food processors and the railroad dictate terms, listened with sympathy to Elias's proposals to join the American Society of Equity. One night in 1907, he hired the Knights of Pythias Meeting Hall and invited farmers and their wives to a dinner. He had bought 5 gallons of oysters from Ed Hayden's grocery, and the diners admitted that they had never tasted such good oyster soup. But they were less receptive to Elias's arguments and his hope for a union of farmers, and Marceline proved a failure. Despite his radical ideas, Elias Disney came to be well liked in Marceline. He was industrious and serious minded, yet there was one note of frivolity in his nature. On Sundays, he hitched his buckskin mare to the buggy and rode to the house of Grandpa Taylor. For an hour or two, Elias and Will Rinsmer played on their fiddles to the piano accompaniment of the Taylor's daughter. Walt sat on a straight backed chair throughout the concert, enthralled by the music and astonished by this unexpected aspect of his father. At most other times, Elias Disney was sober, even dour. The task of supporting a wife and 5 children on a prairie farm had proved more of a burden than he had anticipated, and he brooded over the possibility of failure. He demanded more of his older sons, and only Flora's quick humor forestalled open rebellion. By planting acreage Elias had rented from Robert Disney, Herb and Ray earned $175, and they bought themselves gold watches and chains for $20 apiece. Their father accused them of profligacy and asked what they planned to do with the rest of the money. "We thought we might buy a heifer and a colt," Herb replied. "No," Elias said firmly. "I've got a lot of debts on this farm, and that money should help pay them off." For Herb and Rafe, it was a final tyranny. At noon the next day, Herb rode a horse into town and withdrew his and Ray's money from the bank. After dinner, the 2 sons said they were tired from their day's work, and they went to their room early. Later, they slipped out the window and carried their bags to the Santa Fe station, boarding the 9:30 train to Chicago. The loss of his 2 sons was a blow to Elias Disney and his hopes of developing his 45 acres into a prosperous farm. His efforts had been hampered by his own hidebound notions about farming. Putting fertilizer in plants is like giving whiskey to a man, he expounded. He'll feel better for a while, but afterwards he'll be worse off than he was before. He was convinced otherwise when his neighbors persuaded him to fertilize a single patch of corn and observe the difference. They went dry in a Missouri drought. Elias dug others, but the yield was scant. Oh. The well went dry in a Missouri drought. Elias dug others, but the yield was scant. His apples ripened when the market price was low. He buried the apples in layers of straw as his father had done in Canada. When winter came, the apples remained fresh. The family peddled them door to door. Flora sold her butter to local residents, and Elias declared it could not be wasted at home. In a rare act of disloyalty, Flora buttered her home-baked breads and passed it butter side down to her children. The worst of Elias Disney's bad luck came in the winter of 1909. He contracted typhoid fever, then pneumonia. Roy assumed the burden of running the farm, but it was too much for a 16-year-old boy. Flora argued that the farm had to be sold, and Elias finally agreed. After 4 years of bone-wearying labor, he would get back only what he had paid for the farm. Roy hitched up the wagon, and he and his little brother rode through the bitter prairie chill to tack up notices on telegraph poles and fences advertising the coming auction at the Disney farm. The 2 boys watched sorrowfully as their favorite animals were auctioned to their 2 other farmers. They had special affection for a 6-month-old colt that they had known from birth. The auctioneer sold the colt to a farmer, and both boys cried as they saw it tied to the back of a buggy and led off down the County Pike Road. Later that day, Roy and Walt took the wagon into town to buy some provisions. As they were walking to the hardware store, they heard a persistent whinny. They gazed across the street and saw their colt tied to the back of the farmer's buggy. The colt had recognized them, and the boys raced across the street to hug it and cry some more. Elias had made plans to move on to Kansas City, but he and Flora agreed that the children shouldn't be taken out of school in mid-year. They rented a house in town at 508 North Kansas Avenue, and when school was out in the spring of 1910, the family left Marceline. Walt Disney had lived there barely 4 years, yet that period left more of an impression than any other time in his life. 40 years later, when he built a barn for a workshop on his estate in California, it was the exact replica of the one he had known in Marceline. Chapter 3. All his remembered years had been spent amid the calm fields and country lanes of a farming town. Now the boy saw broad boulevards filled with trolleys and automobiles, the buildings climbing 8 and 10 stories, and the theaters glittered with 1,000 electric bulbs. Noise was everywhere, the call of street vendors, the rumble of beer drays, fire wagons clanging down cobbled streets. The city was unsettling in its strangeness, but the 8-year-old Walt Disney found it exciting as well. Among his vivid early memories of the city was Fairmount Park, a place of amusement 2 blocks from his first Kansas City home. To a boy of 8, it seemed like a pleasure palace with its gleaming white buildings and its sounds of music and excitement. But Walt never got past the whitewashed fence. There was no money to lavish on such frivolity. The Disneys first lived at 2706 East 31st Street in a house with cramped rooms and a privy in the backyard. Elias Disney's health precluded the hard labor he had known most of his life. He bought a distributorship for the Morning Times and evening and Sunday Star newspapers, paying $3 apiece for 700 subscribers. Walt and his sister Ruth were enrolled at Benton Grammar School, and soon Walt joined Roy as delivery boy for his father. Walt arose at 3:40 and claimed the newspapers from the delivery truck at 4:30. The Star and Times had been reluctant to give a franchise to Elias Disney because of his age, 51, and he felt he had to prove himself. He wouldn't allow his boys to deliver from bicycles, throwing the newspapers on porches. He insisted that they lay the papers on the doorstep, making sure that the wind would not carry them away. During the winter time, the papers had to be placed behind the storm doors. For 6 years, Walt delivered the newspapers morning and night, missing only 4 weeks because of illness. In the beginning, he carried the papers in a sling over his shoulders. Later, his father supplied a push cart. The push cart wasn't big enough to accommodate all of the Sunday papers, and after his first delivery, Walt returned to the distribution point for another load. The newspapers had to be distributed in rainstorms and blizzards. Many times, young Walt fell up to his neck in snowdrifts. During storms, he welcomed the end of his route when he visited apartment houses. Then he would make his deliveries from floor to floor in the steamy, heated hallways. The warmth was so alluring that he sometimes sat down in a vestibule to take a brief nap. He always awoke in panic, puzzling over whether he had finished his deliveries in the building, fearing that he would be late for school. Until late in his life, Walt Disney had a recurring dream in which he suffered torment because he had failed to deliver some newspaper along the route. The other newsboys were paid for their deliveries, but not Roy and Walt. Their father gave them small allowances, but nothing for carrying the newspaper. "Your pay is the board and room that I provide you," he declared. Both boys considered that unfair. They believed that a day's work deserved a day's pay, even if the boss was their father. Roy, who was 19 and had graduated from high school, could no longer tolerate his father's domination and his frequent outbreaks of temper. "He still treats me like a little boy," Roy complained to Walt. Roy decided to follow the course of his 2 older brothers and run away from home. One summer night in 1912, he told Walt he was leaving to help with the harvest at their Uncle Will's farm in Kansas. "Don't worry, kid. Everything will be all right here," Roy said reassuringly. In the morning, he was gone. Roy's departure placed more responsibility on Walt. When other boys proved unreliable, it was Walt who had to substitute for them or make a special delivery for a lost paper. When Elias added a new kitchen, a bedroom, and a bath to the Disney home, he insisted that Walt help him. Elias had his own ways of working, and he grew impatient with Walt. "No, you don't saw the board that way. You saw it like this," the father would say angrily, and slap the back of the boy's pants with the side of the saw. On such occasions, Elias struck out with whatever was in his hand, a length of board, the handle of a hammer. Walt learned to run when he saw such outbursts coming. His mother intervened, telling Elias, "How do you expect Walt to know these things? He's only a boy." Walt discovered his own amusements. When the circus came to the city, he followed the parade from beginning to end, his sister Ruth striving hard to keep up with him. He devised his own circus parade, enlisting Ruth and the neighborhood children to help decorate floats atop play wagons. When Ruth became ill with the measles, he amused her with drawings, including a series of figures that seemed to move when paper was flipped. At 9, he had made his first attempts at animation. Walt took a boyish delight in playing tricks on his parents. He was fascinated with magic tricks, and one day brought home a small rubber bladder that could be inflated through a long tube to make a plate rise. He tried it first on his mother's pots in the kitchen. She was startled, then delighted, and she tried the stunt on her husband at dinner that night. Elias was too occupied to notice, but Flora was so convulsed that she had to leave the room. One day, Flora answered the front door to find a nicely dressed woman. Flora began to converse with her until she recognized some of her own clothes. The visitor was Walt in his mother's clothes, a wig and makeup. Flora Disney brought a note of gaiety to what was often a gloomy household. Elias had been perplexed by the defections of his 3 older sons and disheartened by the repeated failures of his enterprises. His thrift was extraordinary. He would walk miles rather than pay a nickel for the trolley, yet he continued with his unpromising investments. He could convince himself that a mining stock or a new invention could lead to riches. He was always thinking up new ways to make money. Remembering the sweet butter on the farm, he arranged for a Marceline dairy to send him a regular supply. Flora Disney loaded the butter into a cart and sold it door to door. Walt accompanied her, but she insisted on pushing the cart herself. Their route took them into the well-to-do district where some of Walt's classmates lived. The embarrassment was something the boy did not soon forget. Most of Walt's school years were spent at Benton Grammar School, and they provided lifelong memories. He reminisced in the 1940 letter to a one-time teacher, Daisy A. Beck. I often think of you and the days I spent at Benton. I can plainly see you and the school principal, J. M. Cottingham, coaching the athletic teams for the annual track meet. I don't know whether you remember or not, but I participated in several events and even won a medal one year on the championship 80-pound relay team. I was kept rather busy with my paper route and didn't have much time to train, but I did manage to get in a few events. Do you remember the time I brought the live mouse into the classroom and you smacked me on the cheek? Boy, what a wallop you had. But I loved you all the more for it. And I can still plainly see the kids marching single file into classrooms to the rhythm of the piano in the hall with you and Miss Catherine Shrewsbury standing over the radiators while the heat billowed out your skirts. It looked very comfortable to me on those cold mornings, and sometimes I wished that I might have worn skirts myself. I remember how Cottingham would break in on any classroom if he had a new story, and all work would cease until he had his fun. He had his faults, but I still think of him as a swell fellow. Walt's record at Benton Grammar School was undistinguished, despite his mother's coaching with his homework. Teachers complained that the boy's attention wandered, that he failed to follow the normal curriculum. Part of this may have been due to exhaustion from the early morning regimen of newspaper deliveries, but Walt seemed unwilling to conform to the ordinary methods of learning. His reading of the classroom assignments were perfunctory, although he made good use of the public library. He read everything of Mark Twain, whose Missouri childhood had been similar to his own. He was engrossed by the success stories of Horatio Auger and the adventures of Tom Swift. The storytelling of Robert Louis Stevenson, Sir Walter Scott, and Charles Dickens also intrigued him. Walt's abiding interest was drawing, but even in that field he could not please his teachers. When his fourth-grade teacher, Artina Olson, instructed the class to sketch a bowl of flowers on her desk, she strolled around the room and stopped at Walt's desk. He had drawn human faces on the flowers, with the arms where the leaves were supposed to be. The teacher chastised him for not following the assignment. He continued to draw things the way he saw them, his earliest efforts duplicating the political cartoons he found in Appeal to Reason, the socialist tract his father subscribed to. Walt became accomplished at portraying the top-hatted capitalist with gold watch across his bloated belly, the oppressed laboring man in work clothes and square paper hat. He developed an ease for caricature, and one day he drew impressions of the patrons at Bert Hudson's barbershop. The barber liked them so much he asked Walt to draw a new character every week. His work was framed on the barbershop wall, and Hudson cut Walt's hair for nothing. His drawing skills helped cement a friendship with a schoolmate at Benton, Walter Pfeiffer. The two boys had become acquainted at school. One day, when Walt went to call on his new friends, he was told that he had the mumps. Since Walt had already had them, on both sides, he was allowed to visit his friend. He brought along paper and charcoal, and he showed Walter how to draw. Walt became a steady visitor at the Pfeiffer house. Mr. Pfeiffer, a jolly German whose laughter filled the house, was an official of the United Leather Workers Union. His daughter, Kitty, played the piano, and he liked to have the whole family join in song. Mr. Pfeiffer adored the theater, especially the Dutch dialect comedy of Weber and Fields, and he rattled off jokes with gusto. After the austerity of his own home, Walt was overwhelmed by the warmth and gaiety of the Pfeiffers. He began spending more time at their house than he did at his own. Through the Pfeiffer family, Walt Disney was introduced to an enticing new world of vaudeville shows and motion pictures. Elias Disney had always considered such entertainment to be frivolous and time-wasting, so when Walt and Walter Pfeiffer started going to the theaters, Walt was careful not to let his father know. Around the piano at the Pfeiffer house, Walt and Walter recreated the jokes and songs they'd heard in the vaudeville houses, and imitating the pantomime of the movie comics. With Mr. Pfeiffer's coaching, the two boys devised routines to perform at Benton School. Walt induced other students to wear funny costumes and repeat the jokes he had copied from the vaudeville comics. His most popular performance was Fun in the Photograph Gallery. Walt portrayed an antique photographer posing his fellow students, then dousing them with a jet of water from the camera. The audience was delighted when Walt produced the photograph, his own caricature of the students who had been squirted. On Lincoln's birthday, when he was in the fifth grade, Walt converted his father's derby into a stovepipe hat with cardboard and shoe polish, borrowing his father's church deacon coat with swallowtail, and added crepe hair to his chin and a wart to his cheek. Principal Coddingham was so pleased with the impersonation that he took Walt into each class for a recitation of the Gettysburg Address, a ritual that continued until Walt graduated. Walt and Walter Pfeiffer entered amateur night at a local theater with Charlie Chaplin and the Count. Walt played Chaplin in his father's derby, pants, and work shoes, and a lamp black mustache. They won fourth prize of 25 cents. Rehearsing as Waltz delivered newspapers, the two boys developed other acts. The two Waltz, the boy from Pittman School, Hans and Mike. Walt sneaked out his bedroom window for the performances, realizing that his father would not approve. One night, Elias and Flora took their daughter for a rare visit to the neighborhood vaudeville house. A performer announced he would stack 3 chairs over his head and balance a boy on top. The Disney's parents were startled to discover that the boy atop the stack was their son Walter. And in addition to this newspaper routes, Walt delivered prescriptions for a drugstore and sold newspapers on street corners. During the noon recess, he swept out the candy store across from school and returned for a hot meal. Work became a constant numbing routine. Sometimes, as he dressed before dawn, he fell asleep while tying his shoelaces. Small diversions gave him pleasure, like playing with a miniature train left on the customer's porch during the summer, or taking a few minutes from his deliveries for football or hockey with friends. Walt looked forward to the times when his brother Roy returned home. Roy had twice gone to work on his Uncle William's farm in Alice, Kansas, walking part of the way and hitching rides on freight trains. Later, he was hired as a teller at the First National Bank in Kansas City. Despite the differences in their age, the two brothers maintained the same closeness they had known on their Marceline farm, and Roy provided counsel from his worldly experience. One day, Elias upbraided Walt for not handing him a tool fast enough. Walt's temper was as hot as his father's, and he replied sharply. Elias accused him of impertinence and ordered him to the basement for a thrashing. Roy overheard the exchange and confided to his brother. Look, kid, he's got no reason for hitting you. You're 14 years old. Don't take it anymore. When Walt reached the basement, his father was still in a rage, and he swung a hammer handle. Walt grabbed it away. Elias raised his hand to strike the boy. Walt held both by his wrists, and his father could not escape. Tears began to appear in Elias's eyes. Walt loosened his grip and climbed the stairs. His father never tried to thrash him again. Accustomed to his father's frugality, Walt rarely asked anything for himself, but he longed for a pair of high leather boots with metal toes and decorated leather strips over the laces, arguing that the boots would be practical for delivering newspapers to the slush and rain. Flora Disney persuaded her husband to buy the boots, and at Christmas in 1916, Walt found them under the tree. He wore the boots every day as he trudged through the morning and afternoon deliveries. One early spring evening, Walt was finishing the Star route at 31st Street in Indiana, where he usually joined his friends for a soda at the drugstore. As he crossed the street, he kicked a piece of ice, then yelped in pain. A horseshoe nail had pierced the boot and jammed into his big toe. His foot was frozen fast to the ice. Help! I'm stuck, he yelled, but a trolley muffled his shouts. For 20 minutes, he endured excruciating pain, and no one offered assistance. Finally, a wagon driver chipped the ice loose and took Walt to a doctor's office. Kid, I've got nothing to give you for the pain, the doctor said. You'll just have to hang on. He assigned 2 men to hold Walt's legs, then he pulled out the nail with pliers. Walt sweated in pain as the doctor removed the boot, opened the wound, and administered a tetanus inoculation. 2 weeks free from the ordeal of delivering the Times every morning gave Walt time to think about his future life. He discarded notions of being a doctor or a lawyer. He realized he had been an indifferent student, and besides, none of the Disney sons had been afforded the luxury of a college education. The show world intrigued him. He had known no greater pleasure than performing before audiences, but he lacked the confidence to compete in big-time vaudeville. Cartooning interested him most. His drawings had evoked chuckles from the patrons of Bert Hudson's barbershop and his fellow students at Benton School. He enjoyed the children's art classes of the Kansas City Art Institute more than his regular schoolwork. By the time Walt's foot healed and returned to his newspaper route, he had decided to become a cartoonist. By 1917, Elias Disney had been in Kansas City 7 years and was growing restless. The newspaper distributorship had not grown as he had hoped, and it was hard to find reliable delivery boys. A new business enterprise beckoned. For $16,000, Elias could acquire an interest in the Ozell Jelly Factory in Chicago, as well as the position of head of plant construction. He invested his entire life savings as well as $20 belonging to his son Walter. Walt, who had graduated from Benton School on June 8, 1917, remained in Kansas City for the summer to help the new distributor with the newspaper route. Herbert Disney, who now had a wife and daughter, moved into the family house, and Walt and Roy continued living there. Roy suggested that Walt get a job on the railroad. Roy himself had worked 2 summers as news butcher for the Santa Fe, selling newspapers, cold drinks, fruit, and candy to travelers. Walt applied for a summer job with the Van Nuys Interstate News Company, claiming to be 16, although he was a year younger. The job required a $15 bond, which Roy supplied from his earnings at the bank. Walt was outfitted with a blue serge uniform with a badge on the lapel and gold buttons marked Van Nuys Interstate. At the Van Nuys office in the Kansas City Railroad station, he picked up hampers packed with fruit, popcorn, peanuts, candy bars, and soda pop. His first run was an 8-hour trip from Kansas City to Jefferson City, Missouri, and Walt placed the hampers in the news butcher's position on the 2 front seats in the smoking car. As the train pulled out of station, Walt stood on the steps behind the conductor, hoping the youngsters on the platform would admire his uniform. It was a hot summer day, and Walt found many customers for soda pop in the commuter cars. Instead of walking back to the smoker, he placed the empty bottles in a box at the end of the train. After a couple of hours, he returned to collect the bottles. He was dismayed to find the commuter cars had vanished. "Those cars are always detached at Lee's Summit," the conductor explained. Loss of the empty bottles wiped out Walt's first day's profit. Roy chided his brother for allowing the company to stock his hampers with overripe fruit. Walt sometimes left the hampers unguarded and returned to find candy and cigars missing. Once he sold soda pop to soldiers who filled a tourist car. They amused themselves by hurling the empty bottles from the train. Walt complained to the brakeman. "Those guys threw my bottles out the window." The brakeman told the top sergeant, who made the soldiers pay for the lost bottles. The romance of railroading was overwhelming for a 15-year-old whose only journeys had been from Chicago to Marceline and Marceline to Kansas City. He rode the Missouri Pacific, the Kansas City, Southern, and Missouri, and the Kansas and Texas lines to towns and cities in half a dozen states. One of his favorite runs was from Kansas City to Downs. Kansas, a slow 6-hour trip during which the train stopped at every station, sometimes pushing boxcars into sidings to clear the tracks. Walt went forward to supply baggagemen with cigars and chewing tobacco, then climb over the tender to the cab, wherein the engineer and fireman allowed him to ride for part of the journey. During long stopovers, Walt explored the towns and cities. One day in Downs, where the train turned around and refueled, Walt was strolling past the store when a policeman accosted him. The boy was accused of surveying the town for a robbery. The officer was unconvinced by Walt's claim of innocence until the train crew verified that the boy was a news butcher. After all-day runs, Walt stayed overnight in railroad hotels or boarding houses, returning to Kansas City the following day. During a visit to Pueblo, Colorado, he recalled that a friendly salesman had recommended a place to stay. Walt located the address, and he was greeted warmly by the motherly woman in a green velvet robe. She asked where he was from and offered to get him a beer. While she was gone, Walt admired the elegant furnishings and gold piano and wondered if the place was prized beyond his means. He heard laughter at the top of the red carpet stairs, and a young cowboy and a pretty girl strolled down arm in arm. Walt suddenly realized he was not in the normal kind of boarding house, and he made a swift exit. The summer travels had brought a new maturity to Walt, but no profit. The overripe fruit attracted flies, and the conductor made him throw it off the train. The empty bottles continued to disappear, and pilferage from the hampers added to the daily losses. Finally, Roy advised, "You better give it up, kid. You're not going to get ahead of the game, so you might as well just take your loss." Walt reluctantly agreed. Summer would soon be over, and he would be joining his parents in Chicago to begin high school. Roy took the loss. Walt forfeited to Van Nuys the $15 deposit that his brother had lent him. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating today. I really look forward to doing this again next week. And I like to end today stating that, remember, today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.